Hi, it's Debbie here, and today I have a watercoloured layered snowflake background to share with you that I used to make a card, and the leftovers I used to make a matching tag. Unfortunately, we are having heavy rain here, and the overhead photos don't do this background justice. But the close-up angle photo, now that's what I'm talking about. There's muted watercolour over heat embossed snowflakes, glitter paste through a stencil on top, and then combined with a few glittery die-cut snowflakes. To start this card, I used the Outline Snowflakes Cling Background stamp from SSS Stamp, and I used a piece of Archer's Hot Pressed Watercolour card. I plan to stamp and heat emboss these snowflakes onto the watercolour card, and the smooth texture of the hot pressed card will give the best stamped impression. I cut the card to just under 6 inches square and placed it in the MISTI along with the background stamp. I treated the card with an anti-static powder bag. This will leave a light layer of powder over the card and help prevent embossing powder randomly sticking everywhere. I used a clear embossing ink from SSS Stamp and stamped and pressed the background firmly onto the card a few times to ensure there was plenty of ink for the embossing powder to stick to. I then sprinkled with white embossing powder from SSS Stamp and used a preheated heat tool to melt the powder to reveal the smooth raised lines of the heat embossing. These lines will resist the watercolour I painted on top. Initially, I used a fair amount of water, and so to prevent the card warping, I taped the piece down to a wooden board. I used a broad brush to paint clear water over the whole of the panel, and then using the wet on wet technique, I brought in the paint and I used Daniel Smith watercolours. In particular, Cascade Green, which is a colour I use often for leaves. It has a lovely grey-green colour, but also a touch of earthy tones mixed in. I also used Ultramarine Turquoise to bring in some blue-green to the mixture. I love how these colours work together in a grey-green-blue medley. While the paint was still wet, I splattered on my favourite solution of Perfect Pearls mixture. I make up this mixture by putting a scoop or two of Perfect Pearls in a mini mister and topping up with water, giving it a good shake, and then using the tube from the inside to splatter the sparkly mixture. Usually I splatter this mixture onto a dry surface, but while the background was still wet, the Perfect Pearls mixed and blended with the watercolours, leaving sparkly highlights. I dried this layer and then started again, but this time I didn't wet the paper. Instead, I brought in the same colours on top of the first layer, and being wet on to dry, the colours were more intense. For this layer, I wanted to create some hard lines, and so didn't blend the watercolours out so much. Then I splattered again with Perfect Pearls and dried again. I repeated this process one more time, and I love the final muted sparkly background. I carefully pulled back the painter's tape, and the best way to do this is to pull the tape right back on itself as you slowly remove it. I gave the watercolour background a buff with a dry cloth, but there was still a little paint over some of the embossed lines, and so I lightly rubbed a damp baby wipe over the top and then buffed again. I often create watercolour backgrounds and then heat emboss on top, and this does give a cleaner heat embossed lines. However, for this piece I wanted the watercolour to pool and collect around the embossed lines, and so I needed to heat emboss before painting. Now that I'd embossed the snowflakes with lovely subtle watercolour over the top, I wanted to add another layer and more texture to the background, and to do this I used the TAP Dance Stencil and Nouveau Glimmer Paste in Moonstone. I held the stencil in place over the watercolour background and then picked up some of the paste on a palette knife. I spread the paste gently over the grid of dots using the same motion as I would to spread butter or jam. I lifted the stencil to reveal the raised sparkly dots overlaying the snowflake background. You could leave the glimmer paste to air dry, but I used a heat tool to speed the process up, and this also caused the paste to bubble and crust over slightly, creating more sparkle and texture. I then cut the piece down to just smaller than an A2 card base. I was undecided at this point where I wanted to go with this card. I knew I wanted to keep the background as the main focus and not cover it up too much, and I debated whether to add a large die cut sentiment, but instead I decided on these holiday words on a line dies. I die cut a couple of the sentiments from Midnight Green card from SSS Stamp and used a Tim Holtz craft pick to poke out the little pieces. I added the watercolour background to a piece of Neenah Solar White card with Gina K glue runner, leaving a portion of the white card showing at the top, and then used Gina K Connect glue to add the delicate die cut along the top border of the watercoloured panel. I trimmed any excess off so that the panel was just smaller than an A2 card base, and then adhered the panel to a white card base with foam adhesive. I die cut an ALICIA snowflake and a few RINA snowflakes from white card and played around with the arrangement. In the end, I decided on 3 RINA snowflakes cascading down the card front. I rubbed Ranger Multimedia Matte over the snowflakes and dunked them into Tim Holtz Dry Rock Candy Distress Glitter before adding them to the card front with Gina K Connect Glue. I added a few enchanting sequins and dewdrop diamonds from Little Things by Lucy's Cards as the finishing touch. I kept the leftover pieces of watercolour snowflake background I trimmed away and used one piece along with the unused ALICIA snowflake and the other Holiday Words on a line die cut I'd not used to create a matching tag using the Stitch Dress Up tag die from SSS Stamp. Well, that brings today's video to a close. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedutydesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.